when it comes to the internet, there is no entity, there is no stakeholder group that can do this alone. If we really want to do it right, we really need to have the participation of as many people from as many different backgrounds as possible in order to be able and make sure that we have taken the different perspectives and we have applied it in a medium that is inherently complex.
Hi, I'm Jhalak.
Hi, I'm Shashank.
And welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast. Konstantinos, it would be great to hear about your journey in internet governance and I guess what's brought you to this point where you're such a well-regarded expert in this space.
Thanks, Jhalak. So very briefly, I studied law in Greece, and I found myself doing my postgraduate studies in the United Kingdom. And completely by accident, I attended a seminar in Oslo that was hosted by the late Jon Bing, who at the time was one of the few pioneers teaching internet governance, and I was immediately hooked. So I explored further opportunities on studying a little bit about this field. I ended up doing my second master's on information technology and telecommunications law in Glasgow, succeeded by a PhD. And here I am now. I am working for the Democracy and Tech Initiative at the Atlantic Council as their as their resident senior fellow. And I'm also leading their work on global governance and democracy.
Yeah, it's always great to hear about people's professional journeys and sort of how they build their expertise in a particular space. Internet governance has sort of, as a concept, started to gain momentum in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the World Summit on Information Society, really was conceptualized between 2003, 2005. And it's such a milestone marker for internet governance. It would be great if you could tell our audience a little bit about what the original context was in which WSIS was envisaged and why it continues to remain relevant today, 20 years on, and why all this interest around the WSIS Plus 20 review that's currently ongoing this year.
Sure. So, I will take you as far back as 1999. That was during the plenipotentiary, the ITU plenipotentiary meeting in Minneapolis. And there were conversations about internet governance. However, at that time, because of course we didn't have Facebook and Google and all those big platforms that currently exist, the focus was mainly about the management of domain names and the domain name system. And for those of you, I'm sure that everybody knows it, but for the few of you that perhaps do not know what that is, that these are the www.coca-cola.com sort of spaces. The conversations were concentrated around an organization called the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, that is responsible for the management of the domain name system. And it was under the purview, the oversight of the United States government at the time. So that raised a lot of red flags for some governments who thought that it would be a good idea to start engaging in a conversation about what exactly that oversight meant and whether it had to move towards a more established international multilateral framework, which was the UN. The ITU was the logical choice because of its subject matter expertise on telecommunications and standard creation. The compromise was calling for this World Summit on Information Society, WSIS, which was supposed to happen in 2003 in Geneva, and it was only meant to be one phase. However, due to unresolved issues, predominantly focusing on financing mechanisms and internet governance, as well as the follow-up and implementation, a second phase was required, which took place in 2005 in Tunis. And very briefly, WSIS is very important because it sort of contextualizes how development is linked to technology. and it has become a key document for the past 20 years, guiding this idea of the interdependencies that technology creates and how those interdependencies can help actually achieve some of the development goals that we have been setting for the past 20 years.
Konstantinos, we've talked about the multilateral element of WSIS. We've talked about, how development goals being furthered by technological advancement underpins WSIS. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what role multi-stakeholderism has played in WSIS. Was this really the first moment in time in internet governance that we saw multi-stakeholderism come in? Is it something that came in later? And what are the different bodies and forums that have been set up as part of this larger internet governance ecosystem who've helped develop this space?
So the term multi-stakeholder did not really appear first time at WSIS. It appeared, if you want, this idea of collaborative governance, because because even the term multi-stakeholder doesn't really show up on WSIS documents, right? But this idea of people coming together in order to be able and try to resolve and figure out very complex issues was new for the multilateral system, but for the internet world, it really existed ever since its origins, right? The one thing that I think a lot of people miss when they're talking about the internet is that it is really a byproduct of collaboration. The United States government at the time funded the creation of a network that would be able to withstand catastrophe. And the people who sat down to figure out this were people from very different walks of life that they came together because they had a specific task. So the idea that within the context of the internet, people need to collaborate and come together irrespective of their backgrounds and try to figure out and resolve complex issues was always ingrained. It's part of the architecture of the internet. It's part of its DNA. And that the challenge was how you take that and you transpose it into a multilateral system that up until that day, the only thing that understood was the participation of governments. And that was the big challenge. And that challenge actually, continues up until now in different shapes and forms. But at the time, it was really due to the United States and Switzerland, mainly, that they were pushing this idea and they were trying everybody else to make them understand that, listen, we need those different stakeholder groups because we need the engineers to explain to us how the internet works. We need the private sector because those networks are mainly, predominantly, the majority of them at least, are run by private industry. We need civil society because we need someone to also start talking about issues of human rights and education and the development goals. And of course we need the governments in order to be able to legitimize and try to put under a policy framework what we are hearing from all those different stakeholders. So that was the challenge, and the big win of WSIS, the second phase in Tunis, was the fact that it sort of legitimized it, right? Between Geneva and Tunis, there was a working group that was set up, and that the working group was tasked to figure out what internet governance looks like. And one of the things that they did was that they came up with a definition, which we can still find in the Tunis agenda. And that definition recognizes the multi-stakeholder model. Tunis, for instance, says a working definition of internet governance is the development and application by governments, the private sector, and civil society in their respective roles of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs that shape the evolution and use of the internet.
Thanks, Konstantinos. And the definition so well articulated by the Tunis agenda continues to be relevant even today. But I want to, you've extensively written about this tension between multi-stakeholderism and growing multilateralism, especially for global governance and internet governance conversations. And one of the critical goals of WSIS was that digital technology should be for the benefit of all countries, and hopefully there should be regional and global coordination so that that goal is achieved. But often, we hear, especially from the global majority countries, that um, access and infrastructural barriers are continuing to be faced by their citizens, and they have themselves had to invest, in those kind of resources. And in this spirit, they often say that based on digital sovereignty and multilateralism, they see these sort of concepts more favorable as compared to multi-stakeholderism. And we've also heard countries say that multi-stakeholderism has not succeeded as it should have. So in this context, what do you think is the future of WSIS, and how should the global majority look at processes like WSIS, and how can these processes be made more inclusive, right, for the global majority? I know it's a complicated question, but I'm very interested in listening to you, what you think about this, as you've written so much about this question.
Thanks. Wow, that's a big and loaded and yes, complex question. Let me try to pull some threads from this. I think that 20 years down the road from WSIS, we should be courageous enough to say that we did a lot of things, but we also did not do a lot of things at the same time. And what I mean by that is that the frustration from countries in the global majority that you have talked about, I think is very legitimate. Because in the past 20 years, we could have done more to create more inclusive spaces for those countries to participate. So here we are now, still talking about the digital divide, still talking about issues of access, still talking about basic infrastructure needs that some countries require, whilst at the same time, in the other side, up north, we are talking about accelerated AI and AI models and all the rest that really only widen the gap between those who do not have access and those who have access to all those new tools. So the trend and the move towards digital sovereignty, because I believe that you've mentioned that term, and we can, if you want, focus more a little bit later. It's pretty understandable, right? Because also the world is in a very different place. And governments are also in a very different place when it comes to the internet and their understanding of the internet and what they want out of it. Having said all that, however, WSIS continues to be extremely important. First of all, think of it along the lines of we are talking about a document that has managed to endure for 20 years, even though the pace of the internet even though the internet itself has outpaced any other legislative attempt, both at a regional level or at an international level. Yet WSIS, because of its flexibility and agility and even vagueness, if you want, has managed to endure for 20 years. And that is pretty impressive, especially for a document that exists within the UN system. The second thing about WSIS is that it is really a people-centric document. And we haven't seen any effort since WSIS to remind us about the centricity for humans when it comes to the internet and technologies. Recently, a couple of years ago, we negotiated this Global Digital Compact, which was an effort, again, by the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, to bring governments together to collaborate around technology. And it was not about the people. It was all about the states. So the fact that WSIS really acknowledges this very important centricity for people is extremely important. And the third element is what I've mentioned also in the beginning, this idea of development linked to technology. And we know by now that technology can actually accelerate the sustainable development goals. It can accelerate countries meeting some of their own development needs. It can help people get out of poverty. It can help with education. It can help with climate change. It can help address issues of gender. Have we done a good work? a remarkable work? No, we haven't. But the fact that, again, we have a document that acknowledges this link is extremely important, especially as we move into 2025 and 2026, and we see various governments even objecting to some of those issues, right? Like climate or gender and so on and so forth. So from the perspective of the value of WSIS, there is an incredible value. We could have done more on implementation and follow-up, but I believe we are given a second opportunity now that we are having the 20-year review to reach that. But that's pretty much our last chance to ensure that we meet the targets that countries have set, but more importantly, that we pay attention and we listen very, very carefully to the countries that feel that they are not included and they have been left behind.
Konstantinos, you mentioned that this is a second opportunity, for us to, um, build out the WSIS process, perhaps overcome some of the shortcomings we've seen over the last 20 years. If you had to really prioritize, what are the top 2 or 3 things you would change to ensure that the next 20 years of WSIS is a lot more beneficial and impactful, what would those things be?
So, thanks for that question, because it also sort of helps me reprioritize and think some of the things that I have been thinking. The difficult part with WSIS is the fact that we are currently operating in a geopolitical environment that is very, very different from 20 years ago, right? I mean, we need to be talking about the big elephants in the room, and some of those elephants is the fact that, the United States currently is not supportive of the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, and it's actually it has rejected it. We need to talk about the other elephant in the room, which is China. And China, compared to how it was 20 years ago, right now is a formidable participant in internet governance discussions, and they actually have something to share. They have their own story to share. They have their own internet environment that they can share and sell. However, I believe that one of those issues that everyone can come together despite those huge disagreements is the issue of access and connectivity. I do not, there is not one single country out there that would object to the idea of ensuring that people have access to some sort of an internet and connectivity. And frankly, I am a little bit saddened by the fact that we are all talking about the digital divide, but we are still approaching issues of connectivity in a very old-fashioned way, where we're only expecting the private sector to come in and give us the solutions for connectivity. Because what we have seen, again, over the past 20 years is that the need for connectivity actually pushes people to become creative. So we have community networks, for instance, that have been operating for the past decade, and they have proven to be extremely beneficial for people, because they are, they're community based, right? A bunch of people come together because no one else would connect them, and they set up antennas and towers, and they manage to connect to the internet, and they manage to connect to the internet that they want, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that they want to connect to the way you and I experience the internet, but they satisfy their own needs. And this is the great thing about the internet, right? That you can bespoke it to whatever you feel like your internet experience wants to be. So that would be the first issue. The second issue perhaps would be this idea of addressing some of the other divides beyond connectivity and access, whether it is gender, whether it is the way people participate within the internet environment. That unfortunately has become a little bit more difficult right now because of the geopolitics. But that would be another issue that we need to address, and it needs to become a priority within the context of internet governance conversations. And last but not least, we need to figure out what the multi-stakeholder model, the personification, better yet, of the multi-stakeholder model. Currently, we are having the Internet Governance Forum. For those of you, again, who do not know it, this is an annual global conference that is happening under the auspices of the UN, and it gathers people from all around the world where we discuss issues about internet policy. Sustaining, maintaining, supporting the Internet Governance Forum and conversations like that on a global, regional, and national level are becoming crucial because they're so linked to this idea of the multi-stakeholder model. So trying to figure out also how to strengthen and evolve these collaborative governance conversations would also be another priority.
Thanks, Konstantinos, for that. And I'll bring up another elephant in the room, which is enhanced cooperation, right? I know that you've written about that, and it was very interesting to read your blog on that subject. And you touch upon how enhanced cooperation is already exists in the internet governance space, how there's a different interpretation between, let's say, traditional Western democracies and the global majority, especially D77 and China. So, would love to sort of hear your thoughts about how this came about and why, or if it continues to be relevant. On to you.
Thanks. And oh dear, yes, this I think that for anyone who has been engaging in internet governance, a conversation and has cooperation is one of those nightmare scenarios every time it pops up, because it has been a contentious issue for the past 20 years. The insertion in the original WSIS documents of enhanced cooperation was a compromise. It was based on this idea it was borrowed as a concept from the European Union, where enhanced cooperation in the context of European politics means allows smaller member states to come together and try to agree on specific policy issues in order to counter, if you want, the power asymmetries and dynamics that were coming from larger member states like France, Germany, and Italy. So the insertion within WSIS was frankly a compromise. And it was for that reason, right? It was try to mitigate some of the power asymmetries that also existed within the international system. It was intentionally not defined at the time. However, although all that vagueness has sort of followed us for the past 20 years, and it has created a huge tussle within the internet governance community, and enhanced cooperation is perhaps the quintessentially most controversial issue. And that is because there have been two attempts to try to figure out what it means and for countries to come to a consensus, and both of them have failed. There seems to be two camps. One camp believes that enhanced cooperation does not need any definition, and that enhanced cooperation is a process that was concluded also with the IANA transition. Parenthesis here, the IANA transition, for those of you who might not know what it is. If you remember in the beginning, I talked about the role of the United States government, the oversight role that they had over ICANN, that organization which is responsible for domain names. The IANA transition was effectively the US government giving up this oversight role to the global internet community. And it was a process that lasted 2 years. And of course, it was and successfully transitioned though that oversight role. So there is one camp that believes, enhanced cooperation is done pretty much, right? We have the IANA transition. This has happened. We are done. But there is another camp that really thinks of enhanced cooperation as a process that requires the creation of something new within the United Nations. And those two camps as you can imagine, because they're so far apart, have never managed to come together in a consensus way and find a compromise. So for the past 20 years, there has been a lot of back and forth, but here we are again right now where we have the 20-year review and enhanced cooperation is popping up again. And because of the state of the world and where we are right now, those extremes become even harder to reconcile. So we need to start moving closer to a middle ground and to a compromise. The fact of the matter is that enhanced cooperation is very important for the global majority countries because, according to Tunis, it allows them on an equal footing to participate in internet policy discussions. Not the technical management of the internet. I emphasize that this is about internet policy discussion. So enhanced cooperation, and as I said, previously, we need to listen to those governments because they do not feel included. In some ways, they're not included, and we need to make sure that they are included. So if enhanced cooperation is something that they lean on for them to allow to feel that they have a leg to stand on in these conversations, then it is important. At the same time, however, creating anything new, especially in an environment where the UN is in a liquidity crisis, is not something that is going to help advance any of these conversations, right? Our goal needs to be to advance conversations around internet governance, to achieve those things that we didn't achieve in 20 years, whether it is about access, whether it is about addressing issues of data, whether it is about addressing new issues like AI and so on and so forth. So enhanced cooperation, we really need to start looking and becoming creative. And this creativity might mean looking at it as an evolving process, as not a monolith, as something that is happening all the time, that is happening within the Governmental Advisory Committee within ICANN, that is happening within the ITU Council, that is happening, that has happened through the Global Digital Compact that I've mentioned a little bit previously, that is happening in coalitions like the Freedom Online Coalition, that is happening within the IGF, that is happening at UNESCO. So effectively, any conversation where governments come together and they discuss internet policy issues should be seen as moments of enhanced cooperation. And on top of that, enhanced cooperation should not be operating in silo, right? It needs to be complementary to the multi-stakeholder model and vice versa. Because taking you back to our, the conversation when we started, when it comes to the internet, there is no entity, there is no stakeholder group that can do this alone. If we really want to do it right, we really need to have the participation of as many people from as many different backgrounds as possible in order to be able and make sure that we have taken the different perspectives and we have applied it in a medium that is inherently complex.
In the conversation about the role of various stakeholder groups in internet governance, one of the things that gets discussed a lot is that industry, especially big tech, larger domestic players, especially in this shift towards a new era of AI investments, um, there is a sense that they really set the de facto rules of the game of the internet. How do you see this unfolding, and how do you see the reconfiguration of multi-stakeholderism? And has industry already played an outsized role in global internet governance, and will that role only increase? And given this evolving space, what can civil society, academia, and public interest researchers do uh, to preserve the spirit of, an open internet that is beneficial for all?
So I want to clarify something here because that's the another one of the misconceptions which a little bit creates some problems in the conversations that we're having around internet governance. Um, the likes of Google and Amazon and Facebook, the things that they're doing are predominantly about the worldwide. They're operating within the World Wide Web, right? Which is an application on top of the internet infrastructure. We need to separate a little bit when we're talking about the infrastructure of the internet, which is the domain name system, which are the protocols, the IP protocol or BGP, which is the border gateway protocol that ensures the communication is happening between networks. We need to separate those a little bit from the Googles and the Facebooks and everything else. And unfortunately, when it comes to governments, they have the tendency of mixing them up together, and some of the legitimate concerns that they have against those big technology companies, they trickle down to the influencing the way the internet is operating. Having said that, I think you're absolutely right, Jhalak, that we are now in an environment where we are having super companies, the Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple and TikTok, and these are companies of size and power that we had never thought of before, and it is very understandable for governments to have a lot of concerns about those things. Those concerns indeed are driving a lot of the global and regional and national conversations around the internet. Sometimes they drive them in ways that, as I said, have a very negative impact on the way the internet works, on the ability of networks to interoperate, on the ability of having global connectivity and reach, on the ability of having an open internet. But at the same time, they have some of the issues that we are all dealing with have brought us face to face with our own worst demons. And this is where academia and civil society come in. They are the only ones who can keep those companies in check. Of course, governments would legislate and governments will try to do what they're trying to do, but keeping them honest is where civil society comes in. And that's why the role of civil society is so very fundamental and critical. That's why civil society talking about human rights is so very fundamental and critical, because those companies operate on the basis of profit. These are private actors. Private actors believe in profit. That's what they're there to do. It is up to academia and civil society to call them out when they have to work with them when they need to, in order to try to, to allow them to create policies and frameworks that are user-friendly and they're not invasive of our own lives, and also work with governments in order to make sure that, the legislation that they put in place is also compatible with human rights, but at the same time manages to keep those companies in check.
Thanks, Konstantinos. And I like the way you framed this around, these companies are super companies, sometimes having revenue streams and profit margins more than the GDPs of certain countries, especially in the global majority world. I'm very curious as I look at the documents that were framed in 2003 and 2005. In some ways, the way the language is framed has kept them relevant. Konstantinos, as you've also mentioned, the vagueness or the principle-based language keeps them relevant even today. And I want to ask your opinion on what you think about renewing some of these Action 9, especially as the focus shifts to emerging technologies that, of course, are in a way already covered by these documents, but do change the way people access and benefit from technology, especially the way we're seeing resource distribution around AI technologies around the world. So do you think that we don't need to change any language to serve a particular technology, which is also fair, or we do need to? I would love to have your opinion on this.
So I have gone a lot back and forth on this issue, frankly, Shashank, myself, and I think that I am leaning towards um, the option of not reopening the action lines. A couple of reasons for that. First, the reality, the geopolitical reality. I believe that if we reopen the action lines, we need to be ready that not only the things that we like will get in there, but other countries, authoritarian countries, are going to start pushing for their own wish list. And we don't have time, frankly, to do this between now and end of December, when WSIS will be finalized. So from a practical and logistical perspective, I would say no. But at the same time, even from a substantive perspective, one of the lessons in the past 20 years is that technology keeps on evolving, and it does so very fast, right? Yet, as I've mentioned in the beginning, WSIS continues to be relevant. I mean, if you think about it, in 2003 and 2005, when WSIS was concluded, there wasn't even Google, right? There wasn't even the idea of talking about AI at the time or quantum. I mean, of course, people were talking it, but no one thought that they would be popularized and democratized to the way right now ChatGPT is, for instance. And I'm sure something else will, in the future. So for me, having a document that manages to capture the essence of that evolution 20 years later is actually a remarkable achievement. And this is where, for instance, this Global Digital Compact failed for me, because that is a very specific document. It talks about information integrity, it talks about AI, it talks about data governance. These are topics that currently, anywhere you look, are at the top of all governments' list. Will they be in 5 years? I don't think so. And will in 5 years, so what will the GDC be in 5 years? Most probably it will be a historical document that will look back and will say, oh, between 2023 and 2027, this is what governments were really obsessed about. But in 2035, okay, we care about something else that the GDC doesn't cover yet. WSIS could potentially continue to cover. And that is a value that you don't often come across, especially in internationally negotiated documents.
Konstantinos, I'd be curious to hear from you, just shifting gears from WSIS towards some of the other global governance processes. You just mentioned the Global Digital Compact. What do you think it is about the way that it has been structured, uh, which gives you pause and makes you feel that it won't be relevant in, say, 2035?
Um, well, the relevance, again, I can only speculate, but in 2035, there will be new technologies that we will be talking about that the GDC will not be covering. I personally was not a big fan of the GDC, mainly because I thought the timing was very off. I never thought, in the past 2 years, especially, I do not get the sense that there is governments are willing to really collaborate. Everything has become so politicized. And I was very nervous with this idea of politicizing the internet and internet governance, which actually has happened. The GDC, the value of the GDC is actually its human rights section. I believe that is the strongest, not necessarily language that we see in the text, but the idea that human rights are very much have become a concrete part of the way we are talking about digital and internet governance. But the GDC was frankly not a multi-stakeholder process. It was a government-written process. I mean, multi-stakeholder participation became a ticking box exercise where, they did a bunch of different things where we were able to deliver 2-minute statements, but we didn't know whether these statements were taken on board. We submitted comments, but no one knows what happened to those comments. I mean, sure, you can see them on the UN website, but we don't really know whether they were actually taken on board during the drafting of the GDC. And of course, but at the same time, and now in reflection, because a couple of years have passed, even though we are into the implementation mode, which also, as far as I'm concerned, has a lot of gaps, and it suffers from true and meaningful participation of stakeholders around the world. But in reflection, I keep asking myself, what are the lessons that we have learned from the GDC in order to be able and so we can take them on board and make sure that they guide us as we move into WSIS and other international intergovernance conversations.
Flowing out of the GDC, we are going to see the global dialogue on AI. We're going to see the AI scientific panel. What advice would you have for academics, researchers, and civil society working in this space on on strategies they should be thinking about, thematic aspects they should be thinking about, um, especially in the context of very rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape, as well as a sort of crisis situation emerging within the United Nations that has been anchoring and driving many of these processes.
Wow. So uh, neither of these processes is going to materially change the way AI governance, and the way AI evolves and accelerates. What one could hope is that there will be a process that at least will be able to act as a coordination mechanism for member states to go and retrieve information. And that scientific panel and the AI global dialogue will be done in a way that is apolitical to the extent that it's possible, of course, within the current environment, but allows also um, countries to showcase some of their own technologies, because there is a lot of AI out there that is happening across the world. Having said that, no one really knows how these processes will run. No one really knows how or whether anyone will be participating. The first AI dialogue, for instance, will be taking place in the United States, and currently getting into the United States is a little bit challenging. So we're already having the first obstacles, practical, right? Obstacles in terms of participating. I think that for civil society and academia, the best way to participate in these processes is through their own governments. Um, there is something to be said about this idea of, and if you cannot go directly to the source, go via anyone that will help you get to the source. And governments are very keen on these processes. We have seen it both within the negotiation period of the GDC, as well as right now that the resolutions for the scientific panel and the global dialogue are being negotiated. So civil society that cannot directly access those two processes should be going definitely through their own national governments, and wake them up, frankly, and tell them that this is happening, and tell them that this not only is this happening, but we need to participate, because if we don't, once again, the processes will be overwhelmed by technologies and ideas emerging mainly from the global north.
Thanks so much for joining us today on the CCG Tech Podcast, Konstantinos. It's been such a pleasure hearing your perspectives and insights on the way internet governance has evolved over the last few, 2 decades, and what the crisis within the UN, geopolitical shifts, and also aspirations, increasing aspirations and articulation of aspirations by countries in the global majority mean for the next 20 years of internet governance. Thank you for spending the time with us today, and we look forward to continuing to find opportunities to engage with you.
Thank you so much, Jhalak and Shashank, for this chat. And, Jhalak, you and I have been discussing in other places some of those issues. And thank you so very much for always bringing that perspective that you're bringing from the G77 and countries in the global majority, and reminding me personally some of those things that I keep occasionally I forget. And so, keeping me always in check. Thank you so very much for having me. I really appreciate this.
Thanks, Konstantinos. It was a pleasure listening to your perspective.
Thank you.
We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link the details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast is created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.